Our final speaker for today's conference is Professor Patrick Nunn. So, Patrick is a geologist, a geographer, and climate scientist at the University of Sunshine Coast. His work focuses on how climate change will affect communities, especially in the Pacific, and how traditional knowledges, including ancient oral stories, can inform our understanding of past events and future resilience. He is a lead author on 2 IPCC assessment reports and the author of more than 390 publications. Professor Nunn's books include The Edge of Memory and Worlds in Shadow, with a new title, Whispers from Celtic Seas, forthcoming in 2026. And he presents a different old, ancient stories, their meanings, longevity, and implications for human futures.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Patrick Nunn, and I'm talking to you today from the University of the Sunshine Coast on Kabi Kabi land in southeast Queensland. And it's a great honor to be here today, and I'm very sorry that I'm not there in person to talk to you. What I want to do today is to talk about some of the research that my collaborators and I have been doing recently into the longevity of ancient stories from different parts of the world, but principally from Australia. And I've titled this talk A Different Old. Okay, it's a different type of understanding of our past that is supplied by these ancient stories and obtained through a study of their meanings and a measurement of their longevity and an understanding of their implications for human futures. I'm very proud to work and to live on the unceded lands of the Kabi Kabi people of southeast Queensland. I want to just start with a couple of examples to really give you a sense of the flavor of what it is that I'm trying to do with this research and with this talk today. There have been volcanic eruptions in 2 parts of Eastern Australia within the last 10, 20,000, 30,000 years, certainly within the 70,000 years or so that people have lived in Australia. And this is a map of some of those volcanoes. Here's an example of one of them. It's a Maar volcano. Lake Eacham fills the volcanic crater today. And we know that this formed about 9,200 years ago. There are stories about what happened. The camping place began to change, the earth under the camp roaring like thunder. The wind started to blow down as if a cyclone were coming. The camping place began to twist and crack. While this was happening, there was in the sky a red cloud of a hue never seen before. The people tried to run from side to side, but were swallowed up by a crack which opened in the ground. And this is a story that undoubtedly recalls the formation of this volcano 9,200 years ago. So it represents a memory more than 9,000 years old. The second example I'm giving by way of introduction comes from Bait Bay in New South Wales. Today it's part of the Greater Sydney area. And there's a story from a Gunamata man recorded in the 1920s that talked about how in the early days the sea was a lot further out than it is today, and people used to gather ochre about 4 kilometers seaward of what is today Gibbon Head. And if this oral tradition is accurate, then it recalls a time when the ocean surface was at least 5 meters lower than it is today, which was a time more than 7,000 years ago. So what we have with this story and the previous story from Australia, we have clear indications that oral traditions of memorable events, volcanic eruptions or sea level rise, can be preserved for over 7,000, perhaps over 9,000 years in oral traditions. And that's really the essence of what I want to talk about today. This talk is organized into 3 parts. I want to talk first about Australian memories of land submergence, like that from Bait Bay that I've just mentioned, more than 7,000 years old. And then I want to introduce very briefly some of the similar stories that I've analyzed more recently from the Celtic coasts of northwest Europe, which also appear to be more than 7,000 years old. And then I finally want to just reflect on the meaning and the implications for human futures of this kind of understanding. So let me start with the first part of this talk, the Australian memories of land submergence, more than 7,000 years old. Here's a map of Australia, and the light orange shows where the coastline was during the coldest time of the last ice age, about 20,000 years ago, when the ocean surface was around 125 meters, slightly more than 400 feet lower than it is today. People were in Australia at this time, or almost certainly they arrived about 70,000 years ago. We can't be sure, but they were certainly here at this time. And over the next 20,000 years, Australia lost 23% of its land area, almost a quarter of its total land area at this time, as a result of the rise in the ocean surface. Ice sheets melted, the ocean surface rose and drowned the flanks of Australia, drowned the flanks of many other land masses across the world at this time. Did people remember this happening? They certainly did. And we had a book chapter led by Nick Reed from the University of New England, who is an Aboriginal linguist. He and I and several collaborators wrote a book chapter in Marcia Langdon's book, Indigenous Knowledge, Australian Perspectives, that came out at the end of last year. We know that people remember this happening, and in this chapter we talk about the 34 places all the way around the Australian coast where groups of narratives recalling land disappearance have been recorded. And obviously I don't have time to go into great detail here. I've mentioned the example from Bait Bay in New South Wales. I'm going to give you 4 other examples shown here by the red circles. One from northern Queensland, one from the Nullarbor in Western Australia, one from South Australia, and one from Victoria and Tasmania. So we'll start with the example from the Wellesley Islands in Queensland. The Wellesley Islands, this is what they look like as you're coming into land. But these are the Wellesley Islands today, dominated by Mornington Island, but also Bentinck and several smaller islands. The mainland in this map is in the bottom left of the map, in the southwest corner. And there are several stories about this. In the beginning, our home islands, now called the North Wellesleys, were not islands at all, but part of a peninsula running out from the mainland. Our people say that the channels were caused by Gangur, a seagull woman who dragged a big raft back and forth across the peninsula and severed it. This is from Dick Ruffs's excellent autobiography in 1971. The second example comes from the Nullarbor coast in Western Australia. This is what it looks like from the air. This is also what it looks like from the air. And sea level rise, I just move me, had caused such stress that one day people determined to act. They poured across the Eucla escarpment, and then they reached the sea, which in those days would have been lower than it is today. And they began piling thousands of spears to stop the encroaching water. In other words, they built a wooden palisade to try and stop the water continuing its encroachment across the land. These bundles were stacked very high and actually managed to contain the water at the base of the Nullarbor cliffs. The third example that I want to use is from Kangaroo Island in South Australia. This is a map of Kangaroo Island on the left or the west of this particular map, and the Fleurieu Peninsula, which is part of mainland Australia, on the right, the top of the northeast of this map. And you can see that the two are separated today by Backstairs Passage there. And there are many stories, Garangeri stories and other stories that talk about a tall, powerful man called Gurunderi, who had 2 wives, and they fled from him along the south coast of the Fleurieu Peninsula, and eventually they managed to cross Backstairs Passage at that time through a combination of walking and wading. In other words, Backstairs Passage at the time that Gurunderi's wives were fleeing from him was shallow enough for people to walk across. But Gurunderi was not very happy with this, and he summoned the waves up to rise and drown his wives, whose bodies became washed south and became the Pages, the islands that you can see on the map there. And since that time, Backstairs Passage has been submerged. And the final example that I want to give from Australia is of the Bass Strait between Gippsland in Victoria and Tasmania. It separates, and many of you will have crossed it, I'm sure, in ferries. But during the coldest time of the last ice age, when the sea level was lower, the Bass Strait was dry land. There was a land connection between mainland Australia and what is today Tasmania. And people, no doubt, walked across what is now the Bass Strait. As the sea level rose subsequently, so some people became stranded on Tasmania. And these are the ancestors, or were the ancestors of the Palawa people who live there still today. And there are several Palawa stories from Tasmania, you can see it in the south of the map there, that talk about when it was possible for people to walk from mainland Australia, Gippsland, in the north there, along a route that took in Flinders and Clark and Cape Barren Islands to reach Tasmania. I have to move me again, I'm afraid. So one story collected in 1831 said that Tasmania was settled by emigrants from a far country. They came here on land and the sea was subsequently formed. The last vestige of this land bridge, and I have worked with Melbourne University astronomer Dwayne Hamaker to develop these ideas, but the last vestige of this land bridge was submerged about 12,500 years ago. So for the Palawa stories talking about when it was possible to walk between mainland Australia and Tasmania, for those stories to be correct, they have to be around 12,500 years old at least. So the Palawa memories have indeed endured for 12,500 years, probably because of their key importance to remembering climate change. Okay, so where do we go next? So the ages of submergence memories. The graph that you can see here shows how the ocean surface, sea level, has changed in the last 13,000 years or so around Tasmania. There's a bit of uncertainty. That's why it's shown as an envelope rather than a straight line. But we can plot on this envelope, we can plot the times when sea level was lower at particular places and therefore determine approximate ages for these. So why is this not happening? Okay, so the minimum age for the Wellesley Islands and the Bait Bay stories, around 7,500 years old. Kangaroo Island, those stories need to be about 10,100 years old. For the Nullarbor, about the same. And for Bass Strait, as I said just now, around 12,500 seems to be the likely date of these, or the likely age for these stories. So these are very ancient stories indeed, and what we are able to do with these types of stories is to demonstrate that great age. So let me just jump quickly to Northwest Europe and talk about some of the Celtic stories that we have from there. I'll talk about two places, the Scilly Isles in the southwest of England and the Outer Hebrides off the coast of Scotland. The Scilly Isles, you can see here, is an aerial shot. This is what they look like today. You can see that if the sea level was 18 meters lower than it is today, 18 meters lower than it is today, then all the main islands would have been connected. And this is exactly what we believe happened when people were first there. And there are several stories. I'm not going to read this one, it's written in Old English, but there are several historical stories that talk about when the Scilly Isles were in fact one large island and were broken up into a series of small islands by a rise in sea level. We map these. There's a recent article in the journal Folklife by myself and a French medievalist. And this is what we look, this is what we can see, that 7,500 years ago, people were definitely on the Scilly Isles, and they were all one big island. By 5,500 years ago, they'd broken up, and by 2,000 years ago, when the Romans got there to dig up tin, the islands were pretty much as they are today. If we jump now to the Outer Hebrides of Scotland, and again, just get rid of me, the oral traditions collected in the 1860s from the people of the Monarch Islands. So you can see them over there on the left in the west of the map there. They recalled when these islands were once connected to the North Uist mainland. And this is what the gap looks like today. Alexander Carmichael was the person who did the collecting. And this is one of the stories that he recalled about the isthmus between the Hesker Islands, the Monarch Islands, and North Uist, talking about how the isthmus became larger and larger, and tradition still mentions the names of those who crossed these fords last, and the names of persons who drowned in crossing. So a very important memory. And there are others in this part of the Outer Hebrides. In 1835, there was an ecologist who undertook extensive research in this area, and he was told stories from local residents about when these two islands here, Berneray and Pabay, were far closer together than they are today. And this is likely to be based on recollections of the submergence of what is now 3.5 kilometer ocean gap. The Lyonesse stories are likely to have originated 4,000, 6,000 years ago, maybe older. The Outer Hebrides stories are at least 7,300 years old. And these compare. They're similar to some of the younger stories that we have from Australia. So what does it all mean? And what are the implications for human futures? Well, from 34 places all around Australia and from several places along the Celtic fringe of northwest Europe, there are stories saying essentially the same thing. Land which is now underwater was once dry. What are today offshore islands were once part of the mainland. The ocean rose across the land and never receded. It never went back. This wasn't just an ocean flood. It wasn't just a big wave, a tsunami. This was a rise in the ocean surface that caused long-term changes to coastal geographies. And these submergence stories we can demonstrate are 7,000, 12,000 years old. Everyone knows that knowledge can be communicated orally, but it's a revelation to many people to learn that this knowledge can be passed on in this way across hundreds of generations, thousands of years. I'm very exercised by the idea that we have Disneyfied a lot of these ancient stories today. We've cheapened them in that way, and that in doing so, we risk losing ancestral memories that could help us navigate the future. And of course, we do our ancestors wherever in the world they came from. We do them a disservice by this kind of thing. Oral knowledges do hold important lessons for the future. Most parts of the world today, risk management is guided by the understandings of Western science. In the past, I would argue that oral societies were no less risk averse, and many oral traditions include lessons about how to avoid or minimize this risk. And what this shows us was that people in the past, our ancestors, survived millennia of climate change, thousands of years of climate change, showing us that it is survivable, even if it requires profound adaptation. So I want to acknowledge the Australian First Nations stories quoted here, and these are the sources of that knowledge. I've written extensively on this topic, so if you're more interested, have a look in your local library for The Edge of Memory and for Worlds in Shadow, and my new book coming out on Celtic stories next year, Whispers from Celtic Seas. I have a website, you can find more information, and thank you very much for listening. And again, my apologies for not being here in person. Thank you.
Wow, wonderful.